very nice to see you all today. Today's session is going to be around behavioural science. Now, if you're not familiar with this phrase, it's nothing complicated. It's essentially what we used to call social psychology. So this is the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. And it's a topic that I've been immersing myself and working on for the last 15 or 20 years. And I've written 2 books on the topic, The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice. Now, if you're not familiar with this phrase and the content in general, the best summation of behavioural science probably comes from a Princeton psychologist called Susan Fiske. And she describes people as cognitive misers. Now, her colleague at Princeton, Daniel Kahneman, puts it a bit more pithily. He says, thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats, and we can do it, but we'd rather not. Neither of those psychologists is trying to be rude about people. They're very well aware that people have phenomenal rational and logical capabilities. But for most of our history, energy has been a scarce resource, and thinking is energy intensive. So when people are making decisions, whether it's in their personal life, whether it's a consumer decision, whether it's a professional decision, we don't generally think things through in a deeply thought through, considered way. Because we're trying to ration that effort. Instead, people make fast, reflexive, quick decisions. And the way that we do that is to use what psychologists slightly pompously call heuristics. And we just call them rules of thumb. What should interest us, in our jobs, we need to persuade people to behave differently. And all of these rules of thumb are prone to biases. So if you're trying to persuade someone and you're aware of these biases, you're essentially working with human nature rather than against it. And all behavioural science is a giant catalogue of these biases. Hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments into the nature of these biases and how they can be applied. Now, today, of course, I can't cover thousands of experiments. So as Garrett mentioned, I'm going to focus in on one very specific area of persuasion. How you can take some of these experiments and apply them to perceptions of pricing and value. How can you make the same product at the same price appear much better value? There are a number of strands to this idea, but one of the broad themes is when people conceive of value, they don't think about value as an absolute thing. People aren't thinking about your product, thinking about the benefits it will bring, and then weighing that up versus the cost. Now, that would be a ludicrously complex calculation. And what people tend to do when they're faced with complex calculations is, almost without knowing it, replace them with simpler calculations that give an almost as good answer. And when it comes to value, people tend to use a relative framework. People think about your product, they quickly think of a comparison set, a competitor set, and then they compare your product to that comparison set. And if you're more expensive, you're bad value. If you're less expensive, you're good value. That idea that perceptions of value are relative should interest all of us. Because what it means is that if you can change your consumer's mental comparison set, you can change their willingness to pay by orders of magnitude. Now, if we look at the commercial world, you see many examples of huge brands applying this to great effect. Now, if we look across the last 20 years, I would still say the best example to explain this principle comes from Nespresso. You know, think about what Nespresso did when they launched. When they launched, they didn't do this. They did not stuff their coffee granules into kilo bags and sell them on the shelves at Sainsbury's. Because if they had done that, and if they charged the same per gram price they do today, they would look astronomically expensive. A kilo of Nespresso would cost about £90. Now, in this situation, who would go to a supermarket, push aside a £15 bag of Dow Egberts and take home a £90 bag of Nespresso? It wouldn't just look expensive, it would look probably morally wrong it was so wasteful. No one would do it. No sane consumer would ever think about doing that. But of course, that's not what Nespresso did. What Nespresso did was sell itself in pods. And once you start selling coffee in pods, the comparison set suddenly shifts because a pod gives you a cup-sized serving of coffee. And as Rory Sutherland said, that shifts the comparison set from Dow Egberts and Illy to Starbucks. So suddenly, the 70 pence that Nespresso want for a pod of Lungo coffee looks amazingly good value compared to the £3.50 that Starbucks want for a flat white. But 70 pence for a pod and £90 for a bag, it's exactly the same per gram price. But by subtly shifting the comparison set, you change people's willingness to pay. Now that simple insight, creatively applied, has made billions of dollars for Nespresso. You can take some of these principles and apply them in a commercial setting to your significant benefit. Of course, Nespresso was done at product launch. It was done when no one had a conception of the value of that product. So it was slightly easier for them. But even the oldest products can apply this principle of price relativity if you apply a dash of your own lateral thinking. So one example from a very, very old category is from the world of trains. If you go back to 2019 and think about what Deutsche Bahn did in Germany. Deutsche Bahn are the national railway provider, and in 2019 they wanted to get people to holiday at home. Stop flying abroad, start visiting tourist sites in Germany. So what they did is scrape people's data. They looked from Facebook and search to see where people had been looking for holidays. So let's say I was living in Berlin. I might have been looking for a holiday in Colorado. They would use Getty Images and show me an image of a beautiful tourist site in Colorado. So this is the Horseshoe Bend in the Colorado River. And they overlaid that picture with data from Skyscanner telling me the real-time airfare, 1,156 euros. And then again, in real time, immediately, they scraped Getty Images again, and they found a remarkably similar looking tourist site in Germany, and they showed me the rail fare to get there. So in this case, the bend in the Mosel River at Brem costing 19 euros. Now that is price relativity in action. Think what most people would do if they were trying to persuade tourists to stay at home. What most people would do was just select a beautiful image of a German tourist site and say the rail fare. Now that's the logical, that's the sensible thing to do. But think about what the comparison set would be in this situation. If you don't shape the consumer's image, you're probably leaving it up to them to decide. And they're probably going to default to a tank of petrol. And 19 euros doesn't look great value compared to a tank of petrol. But if you introduce the comparison set of flying across the Atlantic, well, suddenly 19 euros looks like a rounding error. That's price relativity in action. Change the comparison set, change the willingness to pay. Now, this particular campaign, huge success in Germany. Obviously, it wasn't just one tourist destination they used. They used hundreds tailored to the audience. So if you've been looking at Chinese holidays, they showed you these bridges in Krumlau, Germany. If you've been looking for holidays in Oregon, they showed you a doppelganger site in Bavaria. An amazing campaign with these brilliant tailored messages to the audience. Hundreds upon hundreds of iterations. Not every iteration worked perfectly. There was one that backfired slightly. So they had a series of ads that they served you if you'd been looking for holidays in Japan. So you'd be served this beautiful image of the Tokyo Central Business District, all the lovely neon lights. And unfortunately, the comparison in Germany they thought was sensible was the red light district in Hamburg. I'm not sure what that did for like German-Japanese relations, but you get the principle. The comparison set for your product is not fixed. You have to work out what currently your potential consumer is thinking, and then think how you could shift that to your advantage. Now, it doesn't have to be technologically sophisticated. It doesn't have to be like Deutsche Bahn. Here's an older example, but one that I think shows great psychological insight. Saying to parents, and this comes from Bell Helmets, they're a premium cycling helmet brand. It says, does your kid have a $100 feet and a $10 head? Now, there's only one way of answering that. But the great thing about this messaging is no one would have normally compared a cycling helmet to a pair of Nike trainers. They would have defaulted to other cycling helmets. But if you can creatively think of a reasonable comparison set, that allows you to compare your product to something that flatters you far more. I've got one final example for you. This is my favourite. And it comes from a small mum and pop store in America. And they wanted to sell more Trojan condoms. And this is what they did. Why compare yourself to Durex when you can compare yourself to Huggies nappies? That's price relativity. And if this group of people who aren't even professional marketers, if they can apply it, I think we certainly can. So that's the first broad principle. But then you can take that broad principle and then you can start applying it in very, very specific ways. So you can move from what's called price relativity into a specific version of it called extremeness aversion. So the study in question here comes from Mountain View in America, an agency. And it's a lovely experiment because they ran this study on people and the people didn't know they were taking part. So they were behaving in a realistic way. They set up a bar and they sold Carling for £1 or Budvar for £2. And they found that about 2/3 of people bought Budvar, 1/3 bought Carling. They then introduced another beer. They introduced Tesco Value Lager for 20p. Now, not many people want to drink Tesco Value Lager. In fact, no one bought that drink, 0%. But what should interest us is then what happens to the original 2 drinks on offer. What we see is a radical shift in preference. Remember, it was 2-to-1 in favour of Budvar. Now it shifts to almost 1-to-1. So 47% were buying Carling, 53% buying Budvar. They then test this idea one more time. They get rid of Tesco Value Lager, and then they introduce a super premium beer, Kronenbourg Blanc, for £4. Not many people want to pay £4 for a beer when there's a perfectly good alternative for £1. So you only get 10% buying Kronenbourg Blanc. But again, what we're interested in is that ratio between Carling and Budvar. And again, it radically changes. It's now 90% of people buying Budvar, no one buying Carling. The psychologists call this extremeness aversion, an idea that stretches back to 1993 and the work of Amos Tversky. And essentially, it's the idea that when people are picking a product, they do not just look at the inherent qualities and the price, they are deeply influenced by what it's surrounded by. And the rule of thumb that people often have is pick the middle option. They worry that the expensive option is going to be over-engineered and overpriced, and they might look profligate to their friends or colleagues, but they worry that the cheapest option is going to be poor quality and they're going to look like a miser. So people gravitate towards that middle option. That finding does not just relate to consumer products like beer. Tversky showed it with high-end cameras, Thaler, the Nobel Prize winner, showed it with popcorn, Dilip Soman showed it in Hong Kong with coffee. I've run experiments with commercial, professional decisions around professional services. Again and again, we see people in situations of uncertainty, and I stress most business situations are uncertain. We can never know all the different factors involved. In situations of uncertainty, we use these shorthands like pick the middle option. Once you know that, that's a great opportunity. So if you look around the commercial world, you can see mainstream brands applying this idea. Okay, this is the website for Tide. They sell a free account and they sell a $9.99 business account. Now, what most people would do to try and upgrade the revenue is give more features away, make that $9.99 account more appealing, maybe even discount the price. But of course, once you think about extreme risk aversion, you don't have to do that. You can protect your margins and still encourage people to pick the $9.99 option by introducing a super premium option. You don't expect many people to actually buy the $49.99 option. That's not its role. Its role is to reframe the middle option. No longer does that middle option look like wasting $9.99 a month. Now people can give themselves an alibi. They can tell themselves they're saving £40 a month. You can take that principle and think about it with commercial deals. Never give someone a single price. Always give them 3 options. And make sure when you monitor the success of that, you do it in a holistic way. If you just monitor the proportion of people that take that super premium option, it might look like a failure. But if you measure it holistically and look at direct sales and the upgrading to the premium option, that's when you see the role. Now, again, you could keep on going with experiment after experiment. There are lots of studies that show how to sweat this approach of extremeness aversion even further. So, for example, there are studies from Shotton and Liechtenstein that show most of the ways that this idea is used are incorrect. Most people show the cheapest product, then the middle product, then the most expensive. Shotton and Liechtenstein have shown that on average, you'll increase revenue by 4% if you flip that order. Most expensive, middle, cheapest. Because they call this the order effect of anchoring. It's the first number that we see that is most important at setting our expectations. So yes, many of your companies might already be offering a gold, silver, and bronze package, but I bet most of them are offering it in the wrong order. So if you're applying some of these ideas, there's always a nuance out there that can make those ideas even more powerfully applied. So that's the kind of first principle of the psychology of pricing, relativity. The second principle is people tend to respond to numbers naively rather than fully thinking through what they represent. So I'll give you an example of a study I've done here. And this was with an American audience. We got 282 people together, and we told them about Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And we said, you're in a supermarket, it costs $18.99 for a 12-pack. How good value is that? And 13.7% of people thought that was either good or great value. Next group of people, we give them the same product, the same price, but we added on a couple of extra words. We said that's the same as $1.58 a bottle. And when you do that, you see a more than doubling of that proportion of people who think the product is good or great value. Now you're up to 28.6% now. That is a tiny, tiny tweak that has a significant effect. Because people respond to the numbers that are in front of them. They won't slice and dice those numbers in all the possible permutations so they become comparable to everything else in their life. The onus is on you as a brand to think, how can I communicate these in a way that best reflects on me? So don't talk about the fact that your product costs £10,000. Say that it costs you £960 per month. Or even better, it costs you $96 per person per month. The more you slice and dice that number, the better it will look in comparison. Because what people tend to do is just think what they could alternatively do with the figure that you've put in front of them. And if you talk about 10,000, that sounds like some major investment they're going to have to make big sacrifices for. But if you start talking about 96 per person per month, it feels like something that should be in the tea and biscuits line. Now, you can change how the price makes people feel with these very simple tactics. You can see this certainly in the consumer world. You know, Camden Hells don't talk about £18 for a 12-pack. They talk about £18 for a 12-pack. That's the same as £1.50 a can. Or you can see it from opticians, you know, not telling you the total price, talking about the 20p a day. Very, very simple tactics that can be applied at no cost to your brand, and you can see the results very quickly. Now, I'll give you one final study in this area of people responding to prices naively. And it comes from Uber. So Uber have a well-known behavioural science team. And if you've been in an Uber, you've probably been in one of their experiments. And that's a great data set because you don't know you're taking part in an experiment, so you don't behave differently. And they have a huge number of people in this data set. So they've got great statistical significance. And what they've been testing recently is surge pricing and how people respond. And in their basic test, some people are shown a surge price for 2x, others are shown a surge price for 1.9x. And what you see is a significant jump beyond what you'd expect mathematically when people see that 1.9 price. Now, in psychology, that's known as charm pricing. It's the idea that people have a left-hand digit bias. They don't think of 1.9 as the exact amount, they just think of it as one something. And that makes them behave wildly different and much more bigger change than you expect from what is a tiny change in the price. But that's a very well-known application. The other interesting thing that came from Uber's study was a less well-known point about precise pricing. So they found there was this significant jump in acceptance of surge pricing when they dropped the price by a very small amount. More counterintuitively, they found there was an increase in acceptance of surge pricing when they also increased the price. So people who saw a surge price of 2.1x were more likely to accept that price than people who saw the rounded number of 2x. The argument here is that people think round prices are marked up to a higher degree than precise prices. So if people see a price for £10,000, what they'll be thinking is, well, we know that there's a markup. That product isn't worth 10,000, maybe it's worth 9, maybe it's worth 8. Whereas if they see exactly the same product for £10,355, they still know it's marked up. But when they come down in terms of their calculations for its real prices, they come down in much smaller increments. So they think, okay, it's not worth 10,355, maybe it's worth 10,255 or 10,155. By switching from round prices to precise prices, you shift their perception of value. People have a simple rule of thumb that if it's round, it's probably been overly marked up. So it's a rare situation in which you can actually increase your price and you can increase willingness to pay. You can increase perceptions of value. So again, a very small tweak to your offering that can have significant results. Now, I've just picked 4 different studies from behavioural science. Each of the evidence comes from a different experiment and a different data set. Now, some of those studies might reflect very closely with the world you work in, but other ones, there might be a bit of a gap. And I would say, if you're not 100% convinced by some of these studies, there's probably 2 things to think about. Firstly, investigate the literature. All these studies have been replicated. There are multiple examples that are being applied. That should give you greater faith. The second point is, even if a study has been repeated multiple times, if you still think there's a bit of a slippage between where the experiment's been run and your particular situation, the next reaction shouldn't be to dismiss that study. Think of your research team and your research calendar as a potential to test some of these ideas. Now, take, for example, that unit reframing study I ran about Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Next time you have a survey going out, why not test it? Half of the audience see your product priced as a total amount. Half of the audience see the same product with the same description, but you add on that split into various units or smaller subunits of time. Test it for yourself, see whether it works, and that should give you the confidence to then roll it out. And if you see all these experiments that are in the public domain as fodder for your research, then I think you're approaching this topic in the right way. So I hope that was useful. As I say, I've just covered 4 of probably 1,000 studies that are out there. If I've piqued your interest, there is plenty more to find out. But the key themes today have been twofold. People will not be thinking about your value in an absolute sense. They'll be thinking about it relatively. Use that to your advantage. Shift their comparison set, or think about offering them 3 different prices. And then secondly, people do not respond to your prices as cold, desiccated calculating machines. They will respond to them in a slightly naive manner. You can turn that to your advantage by splitting your costs in the smallest possible units and making sure you always give someone a precise price rather than the rounded one. So I hope that was useful. And if you have any questions at all, I'd love to take them. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, Richard, between the actual neuroscientist that spoke yesterday and now you this morning, I've never felt more in over my head. It's just a chance to learn from someone that's very interesting, and I think that talk gave us all a lot to bring back to our revenue teams, how we price, what we're putting on our websites, how we display this to prospects and customers. It's all very interesting. Let's take a few questions here. Yeah. So, Richard, if you had a 3-choice architecture and you want to anchor customers to the most expensive option, this is actually very interesting, rather than the middle one, what do you do?
So I think there's a couple of options there. There's ways to encourage people to pick expensively, and then there's ways to use that 3-point approach. The first thing to think about with price is that high price is not necessarily off-putting to customers. There's a wonderful study by Babashiv. He's at Stanford. He serves people 5 different bottles of wine, and each of them has a different price label. But the twist in the experiment is there are only 4 different liquids. One of the wines is repeated. Sometimes people are drinking, say, a Merlot, thinking it comes from a $5 bottle, and they rate it poorly and give it a low score. 2 minutes later, they drink exactly the same liquid, thinking it comes from a $45 bottle. Now, not only do the adjectives change, the quantitative scoring does as well. The quantitative scoring jumps by 70%. Now, Shiv argued that what we experience is partly what we expect to experience. And one of the things that sets expectation is price. We have a rule of thumb in our head that things that are expensive tend to be better quality. Now, there's a general truth to that, but that becomes such a strong rule of thumb that exactly the same product will be rated differently according to the price that's set. So one of the strengths of offering people 3 options is sometimes if people have a really big problem, they do not want a cheap solution. They want to pay a higher price. So by having these 3 different options, you're actually making it more likely that they'll pay more and be more satisfied. Now, we use price as a badge of quality. The second thing you can think about, outside of the kind of 3 structured choice architecture we're talking about, is many customers, whatever they say, are deeply driven by what their peers are doing. So there's a long-standing idea called social proof. It's the idea that we are likely to copy what like-minded people are doing. If something looks popular, it becomes more appealing, we're more likely to choose it. Now, that's a fascinating opportunity in the commercial world, especially in B2B, because there are numerous studies that show professionals are as affected as consumers. It's a wonderful study from 2019 by the Australian government where they try and encourage doctors to give out fewer antibiotics. They send out 6,600 letters. Sometimes they educate those doctors. Don't do it, you're causing a massive social problem, etc. And there's a 3.2% reduction in prescription rates. Other times, they send out the education letter and a social proof point within the letter. You are giving out more prescriptions than 80% of your peers. And in that setting, you see a 12.3% reduction in prescription rates. So even this group, who are deep believers in the fact that they are evidence-based decision makers, even they are deeply influenced by these psychological biases. So if you want to steer someone towards that highest end option, you could think about making sure that the consumer knows that that is the most popular choice amongst people like them. So not people in their entirety, people like them. And then the final very direct answer to your question is there is a very related idea called the decoy effect to extremist aversion. And the tactic there is you show someone a basic product with a low price, a medium product that has very little extra benefits and is much, much more expensive. And then you show them the most expensive price that's very comparable to the middle one in terms of price and has far more benefits. So the point is you're trying to make the comparison between an obviously crap middle option and the really expensive one obviously in favour of the more expensive. That's slightly more complicated, but it's a way of steering people towards that top option.
Well, I think my big takeaway is the next time the sales team shows up with 5 requests in hand, I'm going to say there's now surge pricing for product marketing at this company, and we'll see how that goes.
Fantastic.
One more time for Richard.
Thank you very much.